Che Guevara's image is one of the most recognizable in the world. It's on t-shirts, murals, posters, flags, socks, tattoos, bumper stickers, and all sorts of merchandise. What does the image stand for? Is it just a cool decoration, or does it represent something? For some, it seems to represent a solution for all that's wrong with the world, a kind of eternal, all-purpose revolutionary. But who is Che? What did he do to earn his place on your t-shirt? The answers: there's a lot behind this famous photograph and the iconic image that has developed from it. Was Che Guevara the eternal revolutionary, the representative hero of everything that needs to be changed in the world? Some even refer to him as a saint, a savior, and even as a Christ. Who was the real Che? What lies on the other side of this icon?
La familia de Ernesto Guevara es una familia de mucho interés para la historia. El padre tiene su mismo nombre, Ernesto Guevara Lynch, y doña Celia. Los dos presumían de un antiguo abolengo argentino y europeo. Si uno habla de la historia de Ernesto Guevara, ve cómo el padre Guevara Lynch presume de que sus antecesores provienen de hasta las casas reales de Europa.
In Ireland, Patrick Lynch married Agnes Blake. Their second son, Patrick, settled in Buenos Aires in 1749, where he married Rosa de Galaya. Their daughter, Ana Maria Lynch, was Ernesto Che Guevara's grandmother. In 1927, Ernesto Guevara Lynch married Celia de la Serna in Buenos Aires.
Él se crió en ese ambiente que le fue imbuido por sus padres de ser un agente muy superior al medio en que vivía. Yo diría que Ernesto Guevara creyó en esa superioridad de su familia, pero había venido su familia a menos. El padre había sido un hombre rico, había perdido todo el dinero en distintas industrias y en definitiva decidieron años después salir de Buenos Aires para Córdoba y de Córdoba para Rosario. Pero la familia de la madre siempre presumía de que era de una familia argentina de 13 generaciones de argentinos. Así que realmente Ernesto Guevara se creyó siempre desde su niñez de que era muy superior a todos los demás.
En 1958 yo estaba exiliado en Nueva York con mi familia y recibí instrucciones, porque yo no era del 26 de julio, recibí instrucciones del 26 para ir a la Argentina y lograr un reconocimiento de estado de beligerancia en Cuba para poder comprar armas en Argentina. Conocí al padre de Che Guevara en Buenos Aires. Era un hombre de mediana estatura, muy esbelto, usaba sacos de pinta inglesa, pero de lana argentina, y la tarjeta que me entregó rezaba Ernesto Guevara Lynch, arquitecto. Le pregunto, ¿es usted arquitecto? No, pero todo el mundo me llama arquitecto. En esas condiciones conocí la oficina de don Ernesto, como todos los exiliados le llamaban, y era un cuartito, era una accesoria llena de polvo, instrumentos de fabricación. En realidad es lo que era un maestro de obra, sofisticado, pero de arquitecto no tenía nada, ni ingeniero tampoco, así que era un hombre que se ganaba la vida como constructor de edificaciones y viviendas. Pero además estaba disgustado, o el hijo estaba disgustado con él, y le escribió una carta desde la Sierra Maestra para que no se inmiscuyera más en los problemas de los asuntos cubanos, al punto que en la carta le llamó boludo, que es una palabra que no se puede mencionar en Argentina. El padre y la madre del Che Guevara estaban separados cuando yo los conocí. A ella realmente la conocí cuando viajó a Cuba en el avión que nos trasladó de Buenos Aires a La Habana. Era una mujer muy delgada, me daba una impresión extraña de su delgadez, y tenía dos hijos pequeños, eran los hermanos del Che. Uno tendría 14 años, el otro 13 o 12, y eran jóvenes muy tranquilos, y ella parecía una señora también muy normal, tranquila, pero sus antecedentes me llamaban la atención, antecedentes que me había relatado don Ernesto Guevara. Decía que ella había puesto una bomba en uno de los postes frente a la Casa Rosada, en el parque frente a la Casa Rosada, donde había tumbado el poste en la época de Perón. Ya estaban separados en esa época y no tuve con ella mucha conversación, pero sí creo que influyó mucho ella en el carácter de su hijo. Don Ernesto no creo que haya influido mucho, tal vez negativamente, porque Ernesto y el Che estaban peleados. La enemistad del Che con su padre se puso realmente de manifiesto cuando la familia visitó al Che en la Cabaña, puesto que el Che no quiso recibir a su padre. Admitió a la mamá y a sus hermanitos, pero no al papá. El papá se quedó fuera y no lo dejó entrar porque, como se sabe, había un disgusto muy fuerte entre ellos.
It's the fact that Guevara had a mother, from what I know, that was a very central point in his life, and a woman who was also not very mentally stable. Perhaps he got some of that from the mother and the way he looked at the world.
Che Guevara was a person that was raised in a very dysfunctional family. His father was a building contractor in Argentina. He pretended to be an architect, but he really was not an architect. And yet he passed along as pretending to be an architect. So from his beginning, he was part of a make-believe situation. And he was very resentful of the social system in Argentina, and he extrapolated that into resentment of the social system everywhere.
Sin embargo, no hay evidencias de que en algún momento se haya manifestado en contra del gobierno de Juan Domingo Perón y que en ningún momento haya participado en algún tipo de acción en contra del gobierno de Argentina, que evidentemente no representaba en aquella época el sentimiento de la nación.
Ernesto Guevara no puede haber recibido el título de médico de la Facultad de Medicina de la Universidad de Buenos Aires. Yo tuve un intercambio extensísimo de correspondencia con la Facultad de Medicina, donde probé que él no podía haber recibido el título de médico, porque el programa de educación de la Escuela de Medicina, que estaba vigente cuando él se supone que se graduó en febrero del 53, tenía una serie de requisitos que Ernesto Guevara no podía cumplir. Y eso se lo probé a la universidad. Entonces me dijeron que es que el programa vigente cuando él se graduó no era el que por el que se había estudiado, sino era uno anterior, cuando él se matriculó en el año 48. Yo le pedí a la Universidad de Buenos Aires ese programa de estudio. Lo estudié y le mostré a ellos que había las mismas contradicciones. Y cuando le di las pruebas de las contradicciones que existían en los dos programas y le pedí que me dieran copia del expediente académico de Ernesto Guevara, me informaron que no me lo podían dar porque había desaparecido, se lo habían robado. Digo, ¿cómo se lo han robado? Sí, cuando la dictadura robaron el expediente. Quiere decir que la propia Facultad de Medicina, lo estoy diciendo con toda seriedad y tengo documentos para probarlo, admitió que no existía el expediente académico de Ernesto Guevara. Ernesto Guevara fue un individuo que marchó sin rumbo y que no se preocupó de los problemas de Latinoamérica hasta que no vino a conocer a Fidel Castro en México y entonces llegó a Cuba y se envolvió en la revolución. Todos esos años, preuniversitarios y universitarios, etc., Ernesto Guevara no era más que un bohemio o un vagabundo. Y sencillamente, luego, cuando fue conocido, fue un individuo que no le interesaron los problemas de Latinoamérica. Busquen de nuevo qué cosas ha producido él para Latinoamérica, cuáles han sido sus preocupaciones, cuáles han sido las preocupaciones de Ernesto Guevara hacia Latinoamérica, hacia los problemas que hemos tenido en el continente. Ninguno, todos son palabras, palabras y palabras. El primer viaje que él hace con Alberto Granado, que es ese en motocicleta, él lo quieren presentar hoy ya después de muerto como un viaje en busca de la redención de América y de conocer los problemas de la América. Y sin embargo no fue así. Y no fue así por los hechos ciertos. ¿Cuál fue el primer punto que él toca? Él toca con Alberto Granado en Santiago de Chile. ¿Qué está sucediendo en Santiago de Chile? En Santiago de Chile está terminando el periodo de González Videla, que era un presidente que había sido electo por un periodo de 5 años, como son los periodos presidenciales en Chile, y tenía el respaldo de socialistas y comunistas, pero ya al final estaba la Guerra Fría y había perdido el respaldo de estos dos grupos, comunistas y socialistas, González Videla. Y entonces está aspirando por primera vez a Allende como socialista. Era un problema que le interesaba a Latinoamérica y sin embargo en el diario de Ernesto Guevara no hay una sola mención a lo que estaba sucediendo en Chile, donde estaba habiendo una transformación social. Y luego que sale de Chile, sigue a Perú. ¿Y quién gobierna en Perú? Y yo quiero recordar esto, es Manuel Odría. ¿Quién es Manuel Odría? Un general que había llegado al poder por la fuerza, que se mantenía en el poder a base de la Guardia Civil, maltratando a los estudiantes, maltratando a los obreros, eliminando físicamente a quienes que se oponían. ¿Y dónde va a parar? ¿Dónde va a parar Ernesto Guevara en Lima, Perú? Al cuartel general de la Guardia Civil. De ese generalote peruano, Manuel Odría, ahí es donde va Ernesto Guevara. No lo digo yo, lo dice Ernesto Guevara en su libro. Por eso yo siempre recomiendo, lean los libros del propio Ernesto Guevara. Y allí, quien estaba preso prácticamente en la Embajada de Colombia en Perú, Aya de la Torre, uno de los grandes líderes latinoamericanos, el líder de los movimientos indigenistas en la América Latina. Y él no hace mención de Aya de la Torre, ni hace mención ni condena a Manuel Odría. Sigue a Venezuela igual. Y entonces no condena la situación violenta que hay en Venezuela y que hay en Colombia, que es precursora de Rojas Pinilla, y no los condena tampoco. O sea, que nunca tuvo el interés en los problemas de Latinoamérica. En Colombia, cuando él llega a Colombia, este redentor de la América, lo que hace es dirigir con el amigo con que él viajaba un grupo de fútbol. Y él dice, y lo dice él de nuevo, y eso es lo que él se entretuvo. Así que no se preocupó de los problemas que había en Latinoamérica. Ernesto Guevara estuvo en sus primeros años sin contacto alguno, no solo con Fidel Castro, sino tampoco con la causa cubana. Él primero llegó a Guatemala cuando Jacobo Arbenz presidía Guatemala y hubo una revolución.
Guevara llegó a Guatemala realmente como un experimento para ver qué cosa era una revolución. Escribió varios artículos de prensa donde se apreció su inclinación a la violencia, su deseo de limitar a toda aquella persona, a todo aquel medio que no expresara lo que él creía. Y en este momento él creía en la revolución de Arbenz, en el proceso Arbenz. Sin embargo, cuando se produjo la confrontación bélica en Guatemala por el alzamiento que dirigió Castillo de Armas, Guevara no se enfrentó a Castillo de Armas.
Guevara no participó en aquella lucha.
Guevara buscó el asilo en la embajada argentina.
Guevara tenía como costumbre hacer evaluaciones de las personas que lo rodeaban y él hizo la evaluación de aquellos hombres que estaban en la embajada. Y esa misma costumbre de evaluar a las personas que lo rodean lo hizo después en el Congo y lo va a hacer de nuevo en Bolivia.
Guevara no llegó a tener problemas al extremo que cuando las cosas se calmaron y salió de la embajada argentina, pudo recorrer por más de 2 meses Guatemala, pudo irse al campo con su compañera de entonces, la señora Hilda Gadea, sin tener ningún conflicto policial. Lo que significa que Guevara no se había identificado con el gobierno de Arbenz, como en Cuba se trató de imponer esa idea de que Guevara realmente había sido un personaje en el gobierno guatemalteco.
Las personas, los historiadores, tratan de mostrar a Ernesto Guevara como luchando y combatiendo en favor de aquel gobierno socialista de Jacobo Arbenz. Y es falso.
Che Guevara was in Guatemala. He wrote letters home talking about his adventurous spirit. He identified himself as an adventurer. He was traveling all throughout Central America. He was thinking of even going to China to pursue his Marxist idealism. He wrote about being a revolutionary. So this became a very good opportunity for him to pursue another adventure in his life. Che Guevara caught up with the Cubans the first time he traveled to Guatemala. And this is where he met a group of Cuban exiles in 1954 who had participated in the Moncada attack in the previous year, who were there in Guatemala as political exiles.
A gentleman named Nico Lopez, who was a Cuban exile in Guatemala, who was then a Cuban exile in Mexico City. He introduced him to 2 other Cuban exiles in Mexico City. One was named Fidel and the other one was named Raúl Castro. And there they linked up.
Fidel Castro y Ernesto Guevara hacen un contacto inmediato y una identificación inmediata, porque Fidel Castro se quedó interesado por la inteligencia que mostraba Guevara y el conocimiento que ya tenía Guevara de los problemas sociales. Y es que Guevara había sido influenciada por una peruana, Hilda Gadea, que había conocido en Guatemala. E Hilda Gadea, que era aprista del partido de Aya de la Torre, estaba preparada en muchos temas sociales y influyó mucho en Guevara. Entonces Guevara y Castro comenzaron a conversar desde aquella primera noche que se vieron en México y se identificaron plenamente. Ernesto Guevara nunca hizo evaluación de Fidel Castro, a pesar de que había hecho evaluaciones de todas las personas que lo rodeaban.
That's one of these things that, how did he meet Fidel Castro? How did he get involved? How did this whole Che legend get started? Well, it got started simply because he had the great stroke of fortune, you might call it, to meet Castro. And there they linked up. It's interesting because someone with the mentality and the obvious derangement of Che Guevara, had he not linked up with a man that I consider the most effective propagandist liar in modern history, he might have continued the life of a traveling hobo, which he was, mooching off of women, scribbling unreadable poetry, and begging for quarters on street corners, had he not linked up with Fidel Castro.
Hilda Gadea, in her own memoirs, had to mention about pawning her jewelry to pay his boarding house debts that he left behind. A man who was irresponsible, who left behind his wife and daughter in Mexico to pursue a revolutionary adventurism in Cuba. When they were in the Sierra Maestra, Che resented being humiliated by Fidel Castro because after their initial landing and combat at Alegría del Pío, Che lost his weapon, and Castro admonished him in front of others, and he felt very resentful about that, as he wrote in his diary.
El papel de Ernesto Guevara en la Sierra Maestra fue un papel un poco secundario. Estuvo junto a Fidel en un principio y junto a Raúl. Luego Raúl creó el segundo frente del Oriente, Franc País, y él se quedó junto a Fidel Castro. Pero en la Sierra Maestra no se distinguió en ningún combate, como Fidel Castro tampoco se distinguió en combate alguno.
The early guerrilla period of Che Guevara, the one that's most of its reputation is based upon, dates from December the 2nd, 1956, when he lands in Cuba as the doctor with the guerrilla unit led by Fidel Castro, coming from Mexico, till January the 1st, 1959, when the Cuban Revolution takes power. So basically, you're talking about 25 months of guerrilla warfare fighting. During this 25 months, according to his own book, Reminiscences of the Cuban Revolution, published by the Castro government in 1959, Che was, until May of 1957, the doctor of the guerrilla unit, and afterwards he was a field commander, eventually becoming a commandant. At no time did he command more than 100 troops in combat, which is one of the myths surrounding Guevara. They make him out to be this great commander that carried out this brilliant guerrilla warfare in the Sierra Maestra against Batista's troops. In fact, in the book Reminiscences of the Cuban Revolution, he goes into detail of the combats that he participated that he thought were the key battles of the Cuban Revolution. If you take Alegría del Pío, which was the very first battle when they landed, if you discard that one, and if you discard Santa Clara, which was the largest battle, but he never enters into details of the number of casualties, the other 8 battles that he describes in the book, the 2 battles at Alegría del Pío, Los Altos de Espinosa, the Battle of Hombrito, the 8 battles that he describes have no more than 80 people killed in both sides. You cannot describe a battle as something where 10 people on both sides die. And basically, this was the great myth of the Cuban Revolution. In 1959, they published the book, The Manual on Guerrilla Warfare, which is considered a classic. And it is, it's a very well-written book. If you read Reminiscences of the Cuban Revolution by Che Guevara, and if you read The Manual on Guerrilla Warfare, written by Che Guevara, it doesn't take a genius or a professor in semantics to understand that these books were written by different people. It was very probable that the book on guerrilla warfare was written by a committee, and it's a primer for guerrillas. It contains a touch of Mao in the political revolutionary Marxist sense. It contains data basically copied or extracted or very similar to the basic combat tactic handbook of the U.S. Army for basic training of U.S. Army troops. And the style that it's written in, it's totally different from the style that Guevara uses in Reminiscences of the Cuban Revolution. So basically, that part of the 25 months he spent as a guerrilla commander are very overrated, in the sense that he, even in the book Reminiscences of the Cuban Revolution, he talks about the fact that much of his time was spent setting up a base hospital for guerrillas, setting up a hut where cannibalized weapons were reshaped into making out of 5 pieces of weapon, 1 single weapon, where they had sewing machines and made uniforms. So that was the base camp, and he kind of ran Castro's base camp for several months. So when you take into consideration the months he was a doctor and the months he was involved in administrative capabilities, and the fact that he himself confesses in the book that his 8 most important battles only produced 80 people killed, you don't have a picture of Vo Nguyen Giap, you know. who commanded 25,000 Viet Minh against the French. You have the picture of a guy who was basically a platoon commander. And in any other guerrilla unit, he would have been considered a platoon commander. It was a small unit, never commanded more than 100 men.
The relationship between Castro and Che was a simple matter, in my opinion, of Fidel Castro, who I consider to be a very masterful judge of the human psyche, sizing Che Guevara up very early in the game as someone who would be useful to him.
Fidel deliberately wanted to be surrounded with ignorant people, people who will not challenge him. And that was part of the recruitment to people in the Sierra Maestra. And then, of course, if there was somebody who had read a book, it was people like Che Guevara who had read leftist books.
And Che Guevara, for whatever reason, becoming infatuated with Castro almost as a father figure. I interviewed people for my book who said they would see them together sometimes, and Fidel would rip into him mercilessly with insults, and Che would just suck it all up, almost whimpering like a little puppy. You know, it was amazing. And in fact, you read his farewell letter to Fidel Castro, and the groveling is almost embarrassing. Even for those of us who don't think much of either Fidel and Che, when you see this guy, supposedly masterful, brave guerrilla warrior, groveling and calling Fidel Castro the aurora of the cosmos and all kinds of, and the most wonderful liberator in the hemisphere and all these other names, you really have to wonder, you know, this is the I don't think any of George Patton's soldiers ever called him that.
Conocí a Ernesto Che Guevara en la Sierra Maestra en el mes de marzo de 1958, cuando fui a entrevistarlo a él y a Fidel Castro para la revista Bohemia donde yo trabajaba. Allí en el campamento de Guevara yo estuve como 2 meses, conversé con él varias veces. La entrevista que le hice pues, fue publicada en la revista Bohemia, igual que la de Fidel Castro, que lo visité después que estuve con Guevara. Primero fue en el campamento de Guevara. Durante ese tiempo pues, y en las conversaciones que tuve con él, observé una persona que parecía idealista. Hablaba de planes que él quería para Cuba, para América Latina, pero pasado algún tiempo yo noté que en otras conversaciones con él que era una persona que no era transparente, tenía ciertas cosas como ocultas, y en la entrevista pues me hablaba de sus aventuras que muchos jóvenes la tienen, pero en la forma que él me narraba las de él pues no eran, vamos a llamarle, unas aventuras normales. También en esa entrevista yo le pregunté que si era comunista y lo negó, me dijo que no era comunista, que él seguía la línea del 26 de julio, el movimiento 26 de julio, del que era líder Fidel Castro, y ese movimiento pues, como decía Fidel Castro, no era comunista, por lo menos en ese momento ellos decían eso. En ese campamento yo conocí a una persona importante que se llamaba Osvaldo Herrera, y era un joven barbudo, rebelde. Estaba en la columna de Che Guevara, y un día él me dijo que quería hablar conmigo secretamente. Entonces hablamos y me contó que Che Guevara era comunista, que estaba muy preocupado él y otros del movimiento 26 de julio porque para la Sierra Maestra iban a ir los comunistas. Estaban ocultando que era un movimiento comunista, que allí pues estaban fusilando y que estaban adoctrinando con libros de marxistas, leninistas. Allí en ese campamento estaban Camilo Cienfuegos, estaban Ramiro Valdés, estaba el doctor Humberto Sory Marín, que después fue fusilado. Y cuando yo llegué, yo vi que estaban leyendo unos libros Camilo Cienfuegos y Ramiro Valdés. Entonces le pregunté a Osvaldo Herrera, capitán Osvaldo Herrera, capitán del Ejército Rebelde, y entonces me dijo que esos libros precisamente eran sobre comunismo. El Che Guevara constantemente estaba enviando notas, papeles, mensajes al exterior, Entonces esos mensajes eran con contactos que él tenía en el exterior, que en ese momento yo no pude conocer, pero posteriormente pues en otras investigaciones que hice de la vida de él, porque lo seguí, pues pude conocer que eran elementos comunistas.
There is a book coming out about the way Fidel took power and what he was trying to do. And there is one of the big questions is, why did Fidel select Che to command a column? Because there was no reason for doing that at the time. But yet, the notion you get is that Fidel appointed Che because he wanted to have a member of the Communist International in a position of power at that time, and that he was all alone in a plot to take over and bring communism to Cuba. Maybe that's the only explanation that I can give of reasons that people in the United States do not know and don't want to know.
Che Guevara describes in his diary his own experience at having killed a man for the first time. And he really did develop a form of bloodlust afterwards.
Fue cruel cada vez que tuvo la oportunidad. El asesinato de un supuesto delator, asesinato que él condujo, asesinato que él decidió.
Ocurrió que había un campesino, un joven campesino, que se llamó Eutimio Guerra, que lo cogieron preso y lo juzgaron y lo condenaron a fusilamiento, diciendo que era un infiltrado del gobierno de Batista. Cuando este joven campesino lo llevaba el comandante Universo Sánchez amarrado a las manos para fusilarlo, el Che Guevara se atravesó en el camino y lo ejecutó, le dio un tiro por la cabeza con una pistola y escribió eso.
He wrote about the execution of Eutimio Guerra. He went into convulsions for a while and was finally still. Now his belongings were mine.
There are references in Che's diaries of being bloodthirsty. There are references of him looking at the weapons that arrived and being thrilled because, we looked at the instruments of death, and we wanted them. So this is a man who was obsessed with killing. He himself, in letters to his family, had boasted about, here I am thirsty for blood in Cuba.
There was a letter from him that was written when he was still in the Sierra during the guerrilla war. That's where he started personally executing boys, I would call them, men and boys in their late teens, early 20s, without trial, or with the trial, revolutionary trials. And he wrote a letter to his father during that stage, and it says, "Father, today I realize that I really like killing."
I'd like to confess, Papa. At that moment, I discovered I really like killing.
Continúa diciendo Guevara en sus escritos: "No soy moderado y trataré de no serlo nunca. Asaltaré las barricadas y trincheras, teñiré en sangre mis armas y loco de furia degollaré a cuanto vencido caiga entre mis manos". Estos son escritos textuales de Ernesto Che Guevara en sus diarios y en cartas a amistades que mandaba afuera. Pero hay uno todavía más revelador, que es el que él escribió, este pensamiento, estas palabras que llevaban los soldados cubanos que fueron para Angola. Y ese escrito de Che Guevara dice: "El odio como factor de lucha, el odio intransigente al enemigo, impulsa más allá de las limitaciones naturales del ser humano y lo convierte en una fría y selectiva maquinaria de matar".
Yo tengo en mi poder una tarjeta que él enviaba con los soldados de Angola, diciéndole que el odio era la pasión primera de un revolucionario, el odio irreversible contra todo aquello que se opusiese al avance de la revolución.
It's in his famous message to the Tricontinental Conference, where he says that a revolutionary must become a cold killing machine motivated by pure hate. But it's kind of ironic because people who were close to Che Guevara, who actually watched him during executions, don't think that he was a cold killing machine. They think he was a very warm killing machine. He actually seemed to revel in the bloodletting.
I witnessed an execution personally committed by Ernesto Guevara, alias El Che. In one occasion, we developed an operation against a small military site. We apprehend 3 individuals. Our position was to have those individuals to be arrested and wait for warranty for a celebration of court that they will decide if they are guilty or not guilty. Ernesto Guevara flatly refused our idea. And he said, those people need to be killed like this. He pulled out his gun and shot the face of it. He was really murdered. Later on, we learned that he did with other individuals the same. It's a documentary, maybe more than 180 or 200 assassinations, because there were no execution, were assassination committed and directed by Ernesto Guevara, alias El Che. He was a biological murderer.
Che Guevara's career as Fidel Castro's executioner in the Sierra Maestra Mountains began with Chicho Osorio on January 17, 1957. The first execution documented by the late Armando M. Lago, Ph.D., in his book The Human Cost of Social Revolution. Dr. Lago documented 37 executions by Che without due process while in the mountains and on the journey to Havana with Castro. There may have been others not yet documented. Documented executions by Che in the Sierra Maestra Mountains. Documented executions by Che in the city of Santa Clara. Execution orders signed by Che in the city of Santa Clara before he left for Havana on January 3, 1959.
Che Guevara is an Argentinian sociopath who dedicated himself fully to firing squad executions of Cubans. I have been able to document and find 238 Cubans who perished firing squads at the hands of Che Guevara or under Che Guevara's order. He was doing this in 3 different places. Che Guevara had started executing campesinos, small farmers, at the Sierra Maestra, at the something called the Valley, Hombrito Valley, since 1957. And we find 16 campesinos who are executed by firing squad. They include Manuel Capitan, Juan Shang, a Chinese, the Echevarria brothers. I mean, he was executing all kinds of people, whites, blacks, Chinese, the whole world. He entered the city of Santa Clara on the 1st of January of 1959, and by the 2nd of January, firing squad executions start in Santa Clara. They reached 38. On the 3rd, some of them began to get firing squads on the 2nd, and the rest he left them orders to be executed. On the 3rd of January, he took command of the garrison at La Cabaña fortress, a colonial fortress from times of Spain, and started immediately firing squad executions. And there we find 177 firing squad executions at La Cabaña. They even include a 15-year-old policeman. I don't know how he must have lied about his age that Batista would accept him as policeman. His name is Ariel Lima. So his record everywhere is of destructions.
Un señor llamado Che Guevara. Y entonces a ese hombre le dieron la cabaña, que era donde estaban todos los presos. Y ahí empezó la agonía de los cubanos, porque ese hombre, donde quiera que uno iba a estar, mandaba que los registraran, que desnudaran a las mujeres, no las dejaba entrar, le quitaba los pases, y era un atropello terrible. Pero entonces un día fui a entrar a la cabaña y dijeron que por la parte de adelante no podía entrar, que tenía que ser por detrás, que había una calle. Y cuando fui por ahí con una señora amiga mía, cuando llegamos nos encontramos, aquello estaba lleno de mujeres dando gritos. Y nosotros decíamos, ¿pero qué pasa aquí? ¿Qué pasa? Y entonces me dice, bueno, no, que ahí viene en ese carro el Che y no quiere que entren a la visita porque le tiene castigado a todos los presos. Cuando el Che dijo, sí, no va a entrar nadie, porque todas están castigados. Entonces las mujeres empezaron a gritarle cosas al Che, a decirle cosas, algunas con sombrilla que llevaban, le dieron el carro por arriba y todo. Entonces el carro se quedó parado, pero cerró las ventanillas. Y nosotros escuchábamos que gritaban, que llamen a la guardia, que llamen a la guardia. Al momento se apareció un camión lleno de soldados y todos venían con una fusta y se tiraron del camión y empezaron a todas esas mujeres que estaban alrededor de la máquina a darle fustazos por donde quiera que la cogieron. Y yo que estaba un poco más atrás y que llevaba una señora que era más vieja que yo y que llevaba una sombrilla, tuve miedo que la fueran a lesionar a ella, y miré y empecé a correr por la calle para abajo para alejarme de todo aquello. Entonces cuando vi que venía el Che, echó a andar el carro y bajaba también por ahí. Me tiré para un lado que había un muro y ahí me escondí. Esperamos que pasara todo aquello. Y entonces cogimos, nos levantamos y nos fuimos rápidamente porque aquello se puso horrible. Y entonces no dejaron entrar a nadie a ver a los presos. A nuestra gente que estaba allí, que estaban sin comida, sin ropa, sin nada, no pudimos entrar. Nos tuvimos que ir a esperar una nueva oportunidad y poder volver ahí. Eso es todo lo que yo puedo acordarme así. Porque ya hace muchos años que esto ha pasado, pero no se olvida del todo. En el silencio de las noches yo escucho la voz de mi hermano, como decía, no te preocupes, yo no le he hecho daño a nadie. Eso fue lo que yo presencié. Eso es todo.
A mi hermano le echaron que él era el que había llevado a esos 3 muchachos, a esos 3 muertos. Que no era cierto, puesto que lo había montado en el 84. ¿Pero por qué se lo echaron a mi hermano? Porque el que manejaba la perseguidora 84 se había ido para la sierra y había estado con Fidel en la sierra. Entonces no podían acusarlo porque él seguía con ellos. Logré encontrar la dirección de ese señor que manejaba la perseguidora 84 y lo fui a ver. Y hablando con él le dije, ¿usted oyó de la acusación que se hace sobre Rafael García? Y él dijo, no, eso es un crimen lo que se va a cometer la revolución. Ese muchacho le dio ni siquiera una galleta a nadie, que para qué. Entonces le digo, usted va con nosotros ir a la cabaña para resolver ese problema. Y yo, sí, cómo no, yo voy. Y fue con nosotros. Entonces, bueno, esa noche era el juicio de mi hermano. Y yo había ido a la cabaña a ver a Che Guevara con un ingeniero que trabajaba en la compañía, conmigo, en la compañía de electricidad. Y él se había alzado y había estado en la sierra precisamente con Guevara, con Che Guevara. Cuando entramos allí, Che Guevara con todas las patas así, estirada arriba del buró, sin zapatos, rascándose todos los chicotes ahí. Pero bueno, cuando nos vio se puso muy contento porque vio al ingeniero. Oye, ingeniero, ¿cómo tú estás? ¿Qué para aquí, qué para allá? ¿Qué te traes por aquí? Y él dijo, mira, lo que me trae es algo que la revolución puede cometer un error. Y le dijo, mira lo que te voy a decir, aquí no hay toalla para nadie. No quiero que me hables de nada de... No, que mira que este señor es hermano del muchacho. No, y no, en ninguna forma y de ninguna manera. Dejó que él hablara del caso. Entonces nos dijo, miren, él no habrá matado a nadie, o sea, refiriéndose a mi hermano. Él no habrá matado a nadie, pero vestía el uniforme de Batista. Y yo le dije, no señor, usted está equivocado. El uniforme era de la República, no de Batista. Que Batista en ese momento estaba en el poder, bueno, fue una desgracia. Pero a la larga nosotros de ahí no quiso de ninguna manera entrar en razones. Hombre, ese señor se esmeraba en darle el tiro de gracia allí a los que fusilaban. Esa misma madrugada, se hace el 18 de marzo del año 59, a las 1:20 de la mañana, me hace mi hermano. Yo quisiera que ustedes vieran las cartas que él escribió, la clase de hombre que era. Y como él, a pesar de su muerte y todo, nunca condenó a nadie. Él simplemente, al único que condenó, claro está, fue a Fidel. Dice, madre, cuídate y vive suficiente tiempo para que la pueda coger luz. Entonces a su esposa le dice a mis hermanos que no se manchen ellos, que lo último que les pido es que me den muchas misas para que pueda coger luz pronto y salir donde Dios. Y a lo único que les pido es que a mi madre, lo único que les pido es que si se vuelve a casar, que se quede con mi madre. Entonces él, sinceramente, aún a pesar de los últimos momentos, tuvo su calma y al principio pensaba haber hasta dirigido la ejecución, pero después dijo no la voy a dirigir porque yo no me quiero manchar con mi propia sangre. Lo único que quiero es que si me tiren sea el corazón. Y efectivamente después en el necrocomio yo vi que tenía un balazo en el corazón y otro que le rozó la parte interior del brazo izquierdo. Entonces el que le dio el tiro de gracia, claro está que fue el Che Guevara, eso no me cabe duda, aunque yo no estaba allí, pero por razones de comunicación con otras personas, pues más o menos llegué a esa conclusión. Todo el mundo piensa que el Che Guevara ha sido un gran hombre, un gran revolucionario, y eso es lo más asesino. Él se recreaba matando gente, inclusive cuando estaban en la sierra. Le hicieron juicio a un guajirito ahí que lo acusaban de colaboración con el gobierno de Batista y no le pudieron, en el juicio que le hicieron, no le pudieron probar nada. Y entonces el que estaba al frente del juicio se lo dijo a Che Guevara, le dijo, mira, este hombre es inocente porque no le hemos encontrado nada. Y el Che Guevara cogió la pistola y le dio un tiro en la cabeza. Cuando le preguntó, pero ¿por qué usted hace eso si el hombre es inocente? Por si acaso. Esa es una de las tantas leyendas de él que no se cuentan.
When my grandfather was taken to the firing squad, he was asked if he wanted to be blindfolded. And since he was so brave, he was a courageous man, he neglected to be blindfolded. But not only that, I mean, he walked with his head up high. And he actually gave them the order. And his last words were, ahí tienen la revolución, no la pierdan. Meaning, there you have the revolution, don't lose it. Don't lose it, something like that. I'm very proud to be his granddaughter.
Cornelio Rojas fue mi padre, coronel de la policía de Santa Clara y últimamente estaba destacado como jefe de la policía de Santa Clara del regimiento Leoncio Hidalgo. El Che Guevara, que fue el que ocupó a Santa Clara, lo arresta porque mi padre era responsable de ese regimiento. Él pertenecía a la policía y solamente por ser un alto jefe lo detiene.
My grandfather disappeared, Colonel Cornelio Rojas, and as you can imagine, my family was very, very worried. We had no idea where he was. We were just waiting to see what had happened to him. One day, my family receives a comunicado, salvoconducto, that's what they call it, from Che Guevara himself, saying that my grandfather would be okay. It was signed by him. So obviously my family was at peace when they read his note. But it was a lie.
Y nosotros estábamos contentos esperando a mi padre, pero mi padre nunca llegó.
Well, my family found out about the execution actually watching TV.
Yo voy a encender el televisor y ahí veo, sin saber, porque estoy esperando a que mi padre llegue vivo, y que lo que encuentro es que están fusilando a mi padre. El Che Guevara, por orden del Che Guevara, lo están fusilando. ¿Qué clase de hombre es ese que por un lado me firma la libertad de él y ya mi padre estaba muerto?
It was a lie because my grandfather had already been assassinated in Che Guevara's firing squad. It was all a lie. We were a very united family, so everybody watched the execution of my grandfather. It was actually the first televised firing squad.
A mí me impactó mucho porque yo estaba embarazada. Yo no me imaginaba que lo iban a fusilar, porque lo estábamos esperando. Ver que de la forma que lo mataron, que lo asesinaron, me quedé traumatizada, muy mal. Como estaba embarazada, empezaron a dar las contracciones y yo quería salir para el hospital, que el médico me viera, pues estaba mal. La jauría que había afuera eran fieras lo que teníamos a la puerta de la casa, que no nos dejaban ni salir, ni tenían compasión de que yo era una mujer embarazada. No me dejaron salir, tuve que mandar a pedir una comadrona para que me atendiera en mi casa, en la misma cama donde dormía mi padre. Ahí tuve yo a mi hijo, porque los rebeldes no me dejaron salir de mi casa.
My family went through a lot. They were terrorized 49 years ago. My mother was pregnant at the time. She actually gave birth to my brother the same night that they killed her father. She was only 24 years old. And she had my brother in the same bed that my grandfather used to sleep in. So it was very hard for my family.
Yo pienso que el Che Guevara es un gran criminal porque él es el responsable del crimen cometido contra mi padre, que fue fusilado bajo sus órdenes, sin juicio ninguno.
I personally think that it was shown on TV to show what was coming, to prepare the people that the terrorists were taking over, actually.
They were trying to start in Cuba what they called the Red Terror. The Red Terror is referred to the first few months of the government of Lenin in the Soviet Union, where close to 10,000 people were executed. So they were trying to copy what Lenin had done. So Guevara fit it because the Cubans have a tradition, we're not killing him and so. They wanted somebody who was not a Cuban to be directing all this, and that fell on Guevara, who was an Argentinian. And on the first year, they killed something like, the firing squad execution are something like 13 or 1,400. Of course, only 238 of them are by Guevara, but Raúl Castro has more than Guevara. And indeed, they achieved the Red Terror because Cuba was paralyzed. Nobody dared move because they would be sent by, and remember, they were executing without a trial, so you didn't need a cause to be executed by firing squad.
Evelio Mata Rodriguez was my grandfather. He was my father's father. Evelio was captain of the National Police in Havana. From what I hear from my parents, especially my father, he really didn't like to talk too much about him, but he was a very good man who was just in the wrong place at the wrong time, I think. He was put to trial just because he was a police officer with the Batista regime. The whole story with my grandfather was that once he was accused of torturing prisoners in his jail, in his station and all that, he knew that he was innocent. So he tried to seek exile in the Mexican consulate. This is after, the revolution had won and they were in place. He tried to go to the Mexican consulate because he knew the consul general there. He was a good friend of the Mexican embassy. So he went to his old school called the Escolapios in Guanabacoa, and there he got guidance from one of the priests there. And the priest told him, "Listen, you're innocent. You need to turn yourself in, and see what happens. You're innocent. They can't charge you if you're innocent." So he turned himself in to the revolution, and of course they did that mock trial and they sentenced him to the 10 years. And when he went to the prison, he was sent to La Cabaña, which was the main military prison in Havana. And Che Guevara was the head of La Cabaña at the time. Once the paper came through his desk, Che's desk, saying that my grandfather was sentenced to 10 years, Che Guevara decided that no, he should not be sentenced to 10 years. He needed to be put to death as an example to all the other, anti-communists and to the police. So he did a whole separate trial that nobody really heard about. It was, a fake trial, but where the sentence was already known before it was even begun. And they charged him with assassinating people, killing or sending people to get killed. And he was sentenced to death by firing squad. That was a pretty quick time from the time the last sentence was done until he was actually shot. And I got his letter dated February 6, 1959. Here it states he's telling my father and my uncle that he's innocent and that the trial against him was a total farce. Not to assume that this was a fair trial, to know that this is a fake trial and that he was going to fall under assassins' bullets. He states here that he's innocent. He's never said anything to send anybody to get killed, and that he begs my father and my uncle not to seek vengeance for his death. That to just try to improve themselves in life and go on with their lives, and that he'll be watching all of us, from the other life. That's what the letter says, and this is something that I'll treasure for the rest of my life. I'll pass it down to my kids so that they understand the story, and my mother still can't even read this because it upsets her too much, and every time I read it, it bothers me a bit. Just knowing that, what he went through and what he must have been thinking when he wrote this letter, the day before he was killed by firing squad. It's just mind-blowing to me that, the experience he must have been through. So Fidel came into power in January 1st, 1959. My grandfather was killed at La Cabaña by firing squad on February 8th, 1959. And it shows, where he died, which was the Cabaña in Guanabacoa, February 8th, 1:30 in the morning. And the cause of his death is nothing but a dash line, just a line. There's no official cause of death.
The first 2 months of 1959, my father remained at La Cabaña. He was visited by several people from the Communist Party, telling him, "Castaño, you are not going to leave this place alive. We guarantee that." And my father, up to a point, the last 2 or 3 weeks, according to my brother and my sister that were able to visit them at La Cabaña, he knew that he was going to die soon. Of course, during that time, the Communist Party were preparing the trial to see how we are going to make it official that we are going to condemn Castaño, to be in the firing squad because of all the activities that he did. My father is brought to trial. I think was March 4, 1959. And in the way they create this situation, they brought a bunch of people that knew or didn't know my father at that time, and they create some type of a trial that only people who were allowed to accuse my father in that trial. Like, for instance, my mother, my sister, and we knew quite a few people in the Havana area that my father helped at that time. We brought up several of them, to the Cabaña to declare in favor of my father. But they were not allowed to enter at the trial. Only the people that were to accuse. And they invent several things in order to find my father guilty. So after, I would say, a couple of hours of people talking and accusing my father and things like this, I think the fourth at night, 11 o'clock or so, he was condemned, to the firing squad. We had a lawyer that was trying to get all possible information to explain to several judges we have at that time that this is not the right thing to do. So I remember that the U.S. Embassy at that time started making some pressure with Fidel. It is my understanding that a commission came explicitly from Washington, D.C. to talk to Fidel about the situation of my father. And we did an appeal, and they bring my father again, to have another trial the 6th of March. At that time, Fidel was already in contact with the U.S. Embassy or somebody from the U.S. Embassy about the situation of my father. And in that appeal, at midnight again, it is condemned, to the firing squad. And my father is taken inside the Cabaña.
Fusilamientos, sí, hemos fusilado, fusilamos y seguiremos fusilando mientras sea necesario. Nuestra lucha es una lucha a muerte.
El Che Guevara estaba relacionado directamente con los fusilamientos. Desde que bajó de la Sierra Maestra, fue uno también de los que orientó a Castro a la cantidad de gente que había que matar y fusilar en Cuba para poder establecer el sistema comunista. El Che Guevara, como jefe militar de aquel regimiento, ocupaba la casa que antiguamente ocupaba el brigadiero, el general que fuera jefe de la fortaleza de la Cabaña del regimiento durante la existencia del Ejército Constitucional de Cuba. Pero él operaba en el club de oficiales, tenía una habitación, la cual yo pude visitar clandestinamente. Los juicios comenzaban a las 9 de la noche en el club de oficiales, que estaba a poca distancia del paredón o lo que le llamábamos el palo. De 11:30 a 12 de la noche ya empezaban a traerlos para el paredón, los amarraban y los fusilaban. Él llegaba, le entregaban una lista con las personas que iban a fusilar o a asesinar. Él ni siquiera leía los nombres, no sabían quién eran las personas que iban a fusilar, y él sencillamente cogía la relación y la firmaba. Hay un documental donde aparece él firmando una de esas listas. Cuando llega un oficial y le entrega la lista, él mira al oficial, coge la lista, él no la leyó, la firmó, se la entregó y siguió conversando en la reunión que sostenía en ese momento.
For all the recollection, all the information I have from different friends and families and things like this, Che Guevara was now involved in my father's future. Che Guevara at that time was in the Cabaña, following, the different steps that happened during that trial, and waiting, to this the last word, to execute my father. Fidel, at that time, this is the 6th of March, 1959, at midnight, Fidel is in kind of a labor union with the telephonic people, and he's busy some kind of a big assembly, discussing the future of the telephone company or whatever. And somebody approached him that Castaño had been, reconfirmed to die in the firing squad. And he stopped for a second or whatever, called some kind of a helper, and he said, "Tell Che not to do anything because I would like to revise that file again." They tried to make a phone call to the Cabaña, and the phone was busy all the time. So they say, "Go physically." By the time this emissary arrived to the Cabaña with the news that Fidel Castro wants to stop everything until he finished and revise the file, Che Guevara said, "The information came too late, he's already dead."
Guevara was synonymous with terror from the very beginning. A lot of people knew that he was very pro-communist. They also knew that wherever he got to, he immediately started killing people. Somehow the paredón, the death squads get active immediately.
It is our understanding that Che Guevara is the one that killed people very easy and didn't think too much about it. I have other information from people who were in prison at that time, and this is something that we believe that happens, is that at that time, every night, those people who were in prison, they used to hear, the explosion of the different rifles when they shoot people in the firing squad. That night, the 6th of March, there were not that explosion in that place, just 1 or 2 or 3, not the explosion that makes, 20 rifles or whatever. The information I have, based on several people that were in prison at that time, and a couple of people that were around Che Guevara in La Cabaña, 2 of them were friends of my brother during the Boy Scout time in Cuba. And they said that my father was taken to some type of a office that belongs to Che Guevara headquarters, and several people were at that time with my father. It is my understanding that he was tortured, because when we saw the body later on in the cemetery, 1 arm was broken, and then they had 3 bullets in the back and 1 bullet in the back of the head. And that happens in the headquarters of Che Guevara. And that's why we believe and confirm that he was killed in an office, not in a firing squad. Even though that night my father was killed, the priest that was at the Cabaña at that time called and told my sister that there were going to be any execution tonight in this place. So everybody believed at that time that my father was not going to be killed that night, waiting for whatever decision Fidel takes the following day. So at that time, 5, 6 o'clock in the morning, the main newspaper in Havana, Castano, had been killed. I was working at that time in Cienfuegos, so I had to make all the preparations to go back to Havana. And then my mother and my sister, that were the only one able, to go to the Cabaña, went to reclaim the body. It was very difficult. We have to call our lawyer, the same that was trying to defend him at the beginning, trying to make all the necessary paperwork, to reclaim the body. They didn't allow to see the body. They say, okay, we are going to give you the body at the cemetery. And then they arranged some type of a time that is going to be about 2 o'clock that day. I arrived from Cienfuegos about that time too. I was not able to see my father. When I arrived, he was already being buried in the cemetery. At the cemetery, we were the 3 of us, the 3 brothers, my mother, and my grandmother. During that time, I was 19 years old, and my brother was 16. When they arrived there, they said, you have to go, the 2 of us, and you cannot cry, you can't do this, you can't do that, because if you start doing some kind of a show here, we close everything and we expel you from this place. But my sister and my mother wanted to put some type of a uniform that belongs to my father, because he was naked or almost naked in that coffin. My sister at that time was 17 years old. And can you imagine, the situation for a young lady like this to take care of this? So they opened the coffin and they put the uniform, I think was on top of him, trying to put the shirt and things like this. During these maneuvers, according to my sister, they saw a broken arm, bruises in different parts of the body, and the bullets in the back and the bullet in the back of the head. They covered the coffin. We couldn't cry, so we waited until he was buried and we left the cemetery.
Existen evidencias del Che Guevara matando a otra persona con su pistola personal. El caso es Castaño, que era teniente del Buró de Investigaciones en Cuba, y el Che Guevara le pidió el archivo de los miembros del Partido Comunista que habían en Cuba. Castaño le respondió que no estaban en sus manos, que la tenía la embajada americana. Y cuando dio la espalda, le dio el tiro.
Castaño Quevedo spoke 5 or 7 languages, who Guevara assassinated him at his office. I even have his address from his kid. I'm almost finishing now. I've been working for 10 years in documenting all these people that Guevara and the rest of them. Raúl Castro has more executions than Guevara, incredibly enough. So Cuba is an association of murders Inc. That's the way they are.
Llevaba quizás 12 días preso. Yo caigo el 13 de agosto de 1959, cuando los demás compañeros de presos en la Cabaña me comunican del caso de Rafael Salgado, un joven de 14 o 15 años, un niño prácticamente, estudiante del Instituto número 1 de La Habana, que está preso, acusado de haber contribuido a la captura de varios estudiantes en el Instituto número 1. Y me hacen saber de que a este muchacho, niño, lo sacaban periódicamente a fusilar simbólicamente, que esto había provocado que se le habían ido todos los esfínteres, no tenía retención de líquidos alguno en el cuerpo, estaba medio loco, producto de estos simulados fusilamientos. Cuando ya veo una tarde que sacan el Herman Mark y un grupo de señores que eran los que se encargaban de fusilar a la gente en la Cabaña, donde también hacía presencia una capitana llamada La China, que era la que daba el tiro de gracia. Estando en esa situación, sacan a Rafaelito y sentimos el fusilamiento. Todos pensábamos que era simbólico. Habían unos presos que habían ido al médico de la Cabaña y presencian que Ernesto Guevara personalmente le da un tiro por la espalda en la cabeza a Rafaelito, con la consecuencia lógica de que lo mató. Y todo esto fue sembrando en mí la curiosidad de conocer a este personaje, al cual se califica como uno de los asesinos más grandes que ha tenido el régimen de Castro en toda su historia. En la Cabaña se le tenía como el hombre que había provocado más de 200 muertos en las prisiones de la Cabaña solamente. Me enteré por los demás compañeros que era un hombre extremadamente despiadado. Mi primer conocimiento del señor Ernesto Guevara, alias el Che, fue a través de su esposa, Aleida March, una persona que se crió conmigo en Santa Clara. Una vez preso, pues me viene a ver Aleida a mí y me dice que cómo yo me había metido en ese avión y cómo yo había tratado de derrocar un gobierno que llevaba 7 meses en el poder, que tenía toda la anuencia del pueblo cubano. Yo le dije saber que al igual que ella se metió en su revolución, yo quería derrotar al régimen comunista. Ella me dijo: Roberto, tu situación es muy grave, tú has venido en pleno apogeo de la revolución y yo creo que por ti se puede hacer muy poco, pero todo depende de que cuando venga mi esposo, yo lo voy a traer para que converse contigo. Yo le dije: te agradezco mucho ese gesto. Efectivamente, cuando llega este señor a Cuba, ella me lo trae a la Cabaña. Y el hombre con su boina esta clásica de comandante rebelde, las manos en la espalda, comienza a caminar por un pasillo que conducía a las celdas de los condenados a muerte. Yo estoy en el banco sentado con Aleida en primer plano y estábamos hablando yo ahí cotidianamente, sin ningún tipo de problemas políticos, cuando él se para frente a mí y me dice: a ti te voy a fusilar yo. Y yo lo miré y le dije: ¿usted cree que yo, si ganaba, lo iba a dejar vivo usted? Muchas gracias. Él sigue caminando y Aleida se asombra de la respuesta que le doy. Me dice: Roberto, tú no sabes lo que tú has hecho. Yo sí sé lo que yo he hecho. Yo estoy consciente de por qué yo estoy preso. Y de ahí no lo vuelvo a ver más. Sencillamente yo creo y estimo así de que Ernesto Guevara ha sido una blasfemia para todos los que se pueden llamar revolucionarios. Un asesino contumaz, un hombre sin ningún tipo de piedad por el ser humano, un hombre frío en extremo y sobre todo que se creía poseedor de todos los valores y de todos los derechos. Ese es el concepto que yo tengo de este señor.
Yo tenía 16 años cuando participaba en el clandestinaje bajo la bandera del Movimiento de Recuperación Democrática. Ante la noticia que salían de los fusilamientos en la fortaleza de la Cabaña, nosotros determinamos penetrar allí para ver los fusilamientos, cómo lo hacían, en qué forma lo hacían, a qué hora lo hacían. Nosotros, y cuando digo nosotros, con otros compañeros de la edad mía, penetrábamos en lo que era el área del regimiento de la Cabaña a través de una cerca que limitaba con el asilo, o sea, que era inmigración, Discordia, que daba a la parte arriba de Casablanca. Por ahí nosotros entrábamos clandestinamente, brincábamos la cerca y nos íbamos penetrando hasta que llegábamos a la fortaleza. Y después, una vez allí buscábamos lo que era el paredón de fusilamiento. Estaba frente a un túnel que tenía derrumbe y tenía un warning para que la gente no penetrara a unos pocos metros de lo que era la pared, a lo que se le llamó paredón y lo que se hizo popular después en Cuba como paredón de fusilamiento, que era este campo de ejecución. Posteriormente, este campo de ejecución lo trasladaron para detrás, en un foso que da detrás de las galeras donde después nos tocaba a nosotros estar presos. Un fusilamiento conlleva un reglamento. De acuerdo con la Constitución del 40 de nuestra patria, si el pelotón que va a ejecutar al reo se compone de 6 hombres, hay un oficial que toma 6 rifles y todos del mismo calibre y el mismo modelo. A 5 de ellos le ponen bala de salva y el sexto le ponen bala de guerra. Ese oficial revuelve todas esas armas y cada miembro de ese pelotón coge un rifle. Inmediatamente que toma los rifles, el jefe del pelotón da la orden y todos disparan. Ahora bien, el reo, de acuerdo con la ley y con el reglamento, deben ponerle una diana en su pecho, sobre el corazón, para que cuando los impactos de balas den en el corazón y el reo no sufra. Inmediatamente que cae al piso, le dan un tiro de salva en la cabeza. Ahora bien, los miembros que componían ese pelotón de fusilamiento en la fortaleza de la Cabaña, todos tenían balas de guerra y ninguno de los rifles se parecía. Todos eran de distintas formas y todos disparaban. Después que ellos fusilaban al reo, le cambiaban la ropa. Esta la botaban en un basurero. Detrás de la fortaleza de la Cabaña hay una playa que se llama la playa del Chivo, donde había un basurero. Al otro día por la mañana nosotros íbamos a recoger la ropa para ver la cantidad de impactos que tenían y por dónde tenían los impactos. Por ejemplo, en el fusilamiento del comandante Jesús Sosa Blanco, lo fusilaron con una chaqueta. Esta la botaron en el basurero de la playa del Chivo. Nosotros cogimos la chaqueta, tenía tiros por los costados y tenía tiros por la parte de abajo, o sea que los impactos fueron supuestamente por el estómago o por las piernas y por el pecho. Hubo ocasiones en que llegaron a fusilar 12, 13 y 14 en una noche. Nosotros, este amigo y compañero de lucha mío y yo solamente pudimos ver en una noche 6 ejecuciones y el mínimo 2. Cuando se estaban produciendo estos fusilamientos, ellos llevaban personal de la calle a presenciar los fusilamientos y familiares de los militares que realizaban las ejecuciones. Estos familiares, estas mujeres, llevaban a sus niños a presenciar las ejecuciones y cada vez que caía un reo al piso, los mandaban a aplaudir y los niños, junto con los mayores, aplaudían cada ejecución que se producía. Después que le cambiaban la ropa con que eran ejecutados, eran puestos en ataúdes de madera, rústicamente sin forros, y los ponían en unos camiones y los conducían al cementerio de Colón en La Habana. Los cadáveres sangraban y iban regando un hilo de sangre por las calles donde iban. También esa parte pude presenciarla. Ellos se dieron cuenta y después utilizaban unas bolsas de nylon con zipper, unas bolsas muy grandes. Ponían los cadáveres dentro de la bolsa y lo acomodaban en el féretro. Una vez que llegaban al cementerio de Colón, había un área que allí solamente podía estar lo que hoy en día es Departamento de Seguridad del Estado, en aquel tiempo de investigación del Ejército Rebelde. Ellos los enterraban. Si eran 5 cadáveres, ellos los enumeraban. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Iban a donde estaba la familia y le comunicaban que su familiar había sido fusilado por la noche, que fueran al cementerio de Colón, a esa área, y, por ejemplo, llegaban a la casa de un familiar y el número 3 es el de usted, pero no tenían nombre, ni tenían flores, ni tenían cruces. Y entonces el familiar iba a llorar el número 3, pero en realidad el familiar no sabía si el número 3 era el de ellos, o era el 2, o era el 5.
She was 13 years old at the time Fidel came to power, and her father had been a lieutenant in the Batista police. He had done nothing. In fact, he was a priest, a reverend in a religious organization. At the same time, he was a police lieutenant. She went to visit him in prison at La Cabaña fortress, where Guevara was in command, and her siblings that accompanied her had to walk past a wall in which the blood-stained material from people who had been executed the previous evening were encrusted in the stone wall where people were executed. And the reason was that Guevara had given the order that children of people who were held in prison be forced to walk past so they could see what would happen to enemies of the revolution. To me, this was an incredible manifestation of cruelty to children, because what responsibility did the kids have, even if their father had done something wrong, which was not the case, and eventually the father was released and allowed to leave Cuba.
When he is actually chief executioner at La Cabaña prison in Havana, he actually had a portion of wall knocked out of his second-story window where he could watch his beloved firing squads at work. And people whom I interviewed, they said that when you saw Che's face as men were being dragged out of their cells, as men were being tied to the stake, and he was watching from that window, they said there was something very, very wrong with that guy. I think you could probably call him a clinical sadist. I would ask you to consider 500 kilos of TNT going off in the following targets: Macy's, Gimbel's, Bloomingdale's, and what they called at the time Grand Central Terminal. This is what Cuba's Foreign Liberation Department, of which Che Guevara was head, planned for New York City the day after Thanksgiving in 1962, the busiest shopping day of the year. All of these stores packed to suffocation with a lot of women and children, perhaps primarily women and children. This was what they had planned to go off. It so happens that I would say most Americans consider Osama bin Laden a worse guy than Fidel Castro or Che Guevara, only because we had a crackerjack FBI in 1962 that infiltrated this plot and cracked it in the nick of time. You can imagine the carnage. Most people, experts in these matters, tell me that would have made 9/11's carnage look pretty tame in comparison. Many people have questioned the veracity of this plot. It is fully documented in my book. The New York Times, no less, reported on it. And several other books have mentioned it, one of them called The FBI's Greatest Cases. Che Guevara was basically a failure at everything he attempted in life. The plot was an example of a failure, thank God, for a lot of innocent Americans. He succeeded only in the mass murder of innocent, primarily, men and boys. He was, in a nutshell, the chief executioner for a Stalinist regime. That role was essentially the same one that Heinrich Himmler performed for the Hitler regime and that Lavrenti Beria performed for the Stalin regime. Chief prosecutor and executioner. The whole point of these early massacres in Cuba had nothing to do with vengeance, which is how some people excuse him, much less justice, which even some people excuse that also. No, it was a very practical matter, and it was exactly what Joe Stalin did to the Polish officer corps in the Katyn forest in Poland in 1940. Liquidate, literally decapitate any potential contras, any potential opposition to what they were already planning, which was the stealth Stalinization of Cuba. In that, he succeeded. Let's give him that. After that, because what did it take? It did not require any kind of courage. Men were being sent to the firing squad without trial, bound and gagged. As a matter of fact, it came a point where the defiant yells from these men so unnerved the executioners that they started mandating that these victims be gagged so that they could not unnerve them. So they were succeeded there. After that, Che Guevara was promoted. In other words, after the population was sufficiently cowed, after a good number of them were physically eliminated or imprisoned, he was nominated Cuba's bank president, don't you see? And this is what fascinates me, because a lot of people say, well, you know, Che screwed up the Cuban economy. That's typical communist mismanagement. No. Given the goal of Fidel Castro and the communist rulers, the Cuban economy was expertly and is expertly managed. Their point was to destroy capitalism. They were shrewd enough to know that any successful capitalist, any sprouting of it will eventually become in opposition to their rule. So Cuba was not mismanaged. Che Guevara probably thought he was doing to Cuba what Stalin had done to Russia in industrializing it. I think Fidel Castro knew pretty well he was just destroying the economy so he could start running Cuba like his own plantation.
The Council of Ministers of Cuba take a vote among themselves and say that the blood of these counter-revolutionaries is going to be used for the Cuban people. So they began the procedure under Guevara at La Cabaña. Every time they executed, they extracted all the blood from him. As a result, some of the people they were executing did not even have the strength to stand up, and they were shot while they were on the soil. Since I'm an economist, I was searching for the records, the annual trade, what they exported, and I think it is in 1961. I find the Cubans selling millions of dollars of fresh Cuban blood to the Vietnamese government, the North Vietnamese government, and I gave that information to the Wall Street Journal that published it in an article by in one of their articles about Cuba.
We hear from Hollywood, from Robert Redford and many others, that Che had a great concern for the poor, in that this was engendered when he was traveling through South America on his famous motorcycle jaunt. Oh, he saw this poverty and he says, oh my goodness, I must devote my life to alleviating this horrible suffering. Nothing could be more preposterous. There's absolutely nothing in the record that indicates that. As a matter of fact, there is a letter from Che Guevara to his father shortly after that motorcycle jaunt where he says, yeah, I think I'm going to go to Venezuela, maybe to the United States. Why? Because those are the best places to try and make money. I guess everyone at that age has a streak of idealism. It is amazing that Che Guevara, given to us as a worldwide symbol of altruism, probably lacked it even then, not well known. Most of the people executed in the early years were in fact a very humble strata of society. The peasant rebellion, they can call it peasant, but the rural rebellion that took place in Cuba from 1960 roughly to 1966 involved rural, humble folk who did not want to see their farms collectivized, which is to say, stolen by Stalinist government. These were Che Guevara's primary enemies. You know, not the millionaire plantation owners. No, no, no. It was Cuba's humble. Che was, man, he fought against the man. That's what you hear from a lot of young people. He fought the man. No, 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 folks. Che was the man that the humble and the freedom-loving fought against. Finally, Che's usefulness started running out to his puppet master, Fidel Castro. He had destroyed any potential opposition to the regime by executions and setting up the prosecutorial regime, shall we say, or apparatus. He destroyed Cuba's currency, one that was on par traditionally with the American dollar, Cuban pesos. He did away with that as president of Cuba's National Bank. He became Minister of Industries and took a country that had a higher per capita income than half of Europe at the time and turned it into one where Haitians would not even immigrate to. He screwed that up. Finally, even the Russians, even by Soviet standards, the Cuban economy had become a basket case. And they were financing the mess, you know, and they knew who was, you know, at the top of the mess. It was Che as Cuba's economics minister. Finally, they put their foot down. They told Castro, you know, in so many ways, this guy's got to go. And so then we hear this myth that, Che's work was finished in Cuba and his sense of altruism and so on and so forth led him elsewhere to try to alleviate the poor of other countries. Complete poppycock. Castro wanted him out of his hair because the Soviets had had it with the guy. He goes to the Dominican Republic, to the Congo, complete failures, complete failures. He could not. This is one of the most amazing things about this. We've got a guy who is known as a guerrilla fighter. We'll be having a movie, Guerrilla. Yet the man never fought in a proper guerrilla war. And when everyone started that he was involved in, he and his troops were completely wiped out and defeated. And that's exactly what happened to him in the Dominican Republic. That's what happened to him in the Congo. And heaven knows that's what happened to him in short order when he went to Bolivia. A lot of research shows about Che's trip to Bolivia, his very ill-starred to try to foment a revolution there, shows that Castro knew that the thing was hopeless from the beginning. Bolivia, of all Latin American countries, had had a form of land reform, ironically, during the very time that Che Guevara was traveling through it on his motorcycle journey. So of all people, he should have known better. But it was a way, I think, for Castro to finally be rid of the guy. It's very interesting because the very CIA men who went down to Bolivia to help hunt him down have reported to me during the course of my research that they were getting information about Che Guevara's whereabouts from the Bolivian Communist Party, which is a very Soviet-line party, which is to say they were probably getting it from Fidel Castro directly. You know, it's amazing, this guerrilla fighter that we hear about, this masterful, some seemingly sane historians put him alongside Mao Zedong. Yet if you actually study Che Guevara's campaign in Bolivia, you have got to come to the conclusion that the man was incapable of applying a compass reading to a map. He split his small forces. He was never able to recruit any Bolivian peasants in any number, and they bumbled around within miles of each other, just stumbling around, apparently unable to read compasses. There are portions, and this is admitted to in Che's own diaries, where the two groups were actually shooting at each other. I've had some reviewers refer to my book as Roberto, this is actually a very funny book. And you hate to laugh at a mass murderer and a sadist, but there comes a point where you almost have to because of the idolatry surrounding his legend. When you see people like Carlos Santana, you just have to laugh. You see him so proudly sporting his Che Guevara shirts, among others. Eric Burden does it too. And these people think they are so cool and so hip and so in tune by showing off. Here's what they were doing. In the mid-60s, people who dug rock and roll, who tried to listen to, basically people who tried to look like that Che Guevara that you see on the t-shirts, were sent to prison camps for the crime of trying to look like the guy on the t-shirt and listen to rock and roll music. So think about what Eric Burden and Santana are doing it. They think they are so cool and so hip while showing off the emblem of a regime that made it a criminal offense to listen to their music. As I say, there comes a point you just have to laugh at the stupidity.
Well, we all have to know that Che Guevara was an extremely cruel man. I have a direct story from a lady who came to me while I was in a funeral in Miami about 20 years ago. And she learned that I participated in the capture of Che Guevara. And she told me that her son was on his 15 or 16-year-old at the time, and he was being ordered to be executed for writing things on the wall. And she asked to talk to Che Guevara, and he received her. And he said, "What can I do for you, lady?" And she told him that her son was very young, that he will not do it again, and please to save his life. So Che Guevara asked what was the name of her son, and when was he going to be executed. She said she was going to be executed that Friday and gave him the name. It was on a Monday. So Che Guevara called to an assistant, and she thought that she had saved his life. And his reaction was, "Get the lady's son so-and-so and execute him now so she doesn't have to wait until Friday." And that's a similar story like that I have heard. And even in the Sierra Maestra, when he executed a very young kid for stealing a condensed milk can to make an example. An officer from the Central Intelligence Agency came down to Miami to interview 16 Cubans working for them. And out of the 16, they selected 2, and I was one of them. Well, we were summoned to Washington, D.C., and we were told there that Che Guevara indeed was in Bolivia, and they wanted us to track him down. Our mission was to support the 2nd Ranger Battalion in Bolivia with intelligence. When he was first apprehended and we got the information from the intelligence team that captured him, it was a very sick jungle and he ran into his shoulder. The Bolivian who was helping him, Willie Simon Cubas, was helping Guevara when they faced the unit that would capture him. And his reaction was, no tiren que yo soy el Che, yo le valgo más vivo que muerto. Don't shoot, I am Che. I am worse to you more alive than death. That was his reaction at the time. The orders came from the High Bolivian Command. I'm sure it came from the President and from General Ovando Candia. And it was a phone call that I received in Higueras where they gave the code 500-600. We had agreed ahead of time that 500 was Che Guevara, 600 was dead, and 700 was alive. That decision to execute him came the same day that he was captured from the High Bolivian Command. I was at the time in Higueras when a phone call arrived. Our instruction from the U.S. government was to try to keep him alive at all costs.
The United States had a special concern about Che and the possibility of many Vietnams in Latin America. What Castro was trying to do is to create many revolutionary focus in Latin America that would divert U.S. attention and force the United States to spend a lot of money and a lot of efforts in Latin America. Spearheading this was Che Guevara, who, after his visit to Congo, came to Cuba and then went to Bolivia. I think it's important to emphasize that Fidel Castro wanted Che Guevara out of Cuba. He felt that he was an embarrassment to the Cuban government. Che Guevara was criticizing the Soviet Union for lack of support of the Vietnam War. He was an admirer of the Chinese actions in Vietnam. So Fidel Castro, at the time that he was moving closer to the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union was supporting him with great amounts of money and weapons, the Cuban regime felt that Che would be better out of Cuba. So that's how we developed the focus in Bolivia, and that's how Che came to become a guerrilla in Bolivia. Naturally, the United States would have liked to capture him and get him out of Bolivia, and tried somewhat successfully.
They knew that he had a fallout with Castro because of the ideology of him being pro-Chinese, and they thought that he might be able to cooperate on the long run. So they had planes and helicopters available to evacuate him to Panama. Nevertheless, that day when the order came from the High Command to execute him, I passed it on to Colonel Centeno. And he looked at me and said, Felix, we know we are working empirically, we owe you a lot of, but this is order from my president, my commander-in-chief. He looked at his watch and he said, you have until 2 o'clock in the afternoon to interrogate him, but I want your word of honor that you will bring me back the dead body of Che at 2 o'clock. I say, Comandante, Coronel, try to make them change their mind. I think it is important that we can get him for interrogation. He said, well, I will try it. And I wait and see what happened. I told him then, try your best, but if it doesn't work, I'll give you my word of honor that I will bring you back the dead body of Che. We embraced and he left. I think the Bolivian was looking at the problem they were having already with the trial of Debray and Bustos, who was being very problematic, very costly to them. They had the French embassy involved defending Debray, they had the Argentinian embassy defending Bustos, they had a student in a strike, and I guess they felt that this was with two unknown individuals what would be a trial to Che Guevara. That's what prompted their decision to eliminate him. Looking back, I thought that maybe I could try to save his life. But then I thought what happened when they released Fidel Castro from prison and what happened to the Cuban people. So I felt that was the decision of the Bolivian government. He had invaded their country and we should not interfere in. We were just advisors. They were the commanders.
The Institute for Cuban and Cuban American Studies at the University of Miami, which is the one that I direct, has for the past 9 or 10 years tried to show what has happened in Cuba, what is happening in Cuba in an objective, serious, analytical way. The problem is that people that fall in love with Che Guevara do not accept analytical, serious research. They fall in love in part because of the propaganda of the Cuban government, in part because they need an icon or they need something to hang their hats on. So it's very, very difficult, and there are significant ideological influences of the left
in the academic world, and it's very, very difficult to convince professors and so on that Che Guevara was a myth, that Che Guevara was not what appears in the magazines and in life. There are books that have been written about Che Guevara which show exactly what he was, but those are not the ones that received the attention. The ones that received the attention are the ones that idealized Che Guevara and so on. A lot of people dislike the United States, and they use Che Guevara to reaffirm their ideology and their point of view, and they use Che Guevara as the icon against the United States.
Well, I was waiting to see what happened when this lady came to me with a little radio, and she said, "Mi Capitan, when are you going to execute him?" I say, "Lady, why are you saying that?" I say, "Well, we saw you taking a picture with him out there, and look," she showed me the radio and said, "The radio is already giving the news that he died from combat wounds." So at that point in time, I knew there was nothing to wait, so I came into the room. I stood in front of him and said, "Commander, I'm sorry. I tried my best." He turned white like a piece of paper and said, "It's better this way. I should have never been captured alive." Then he pulled out his pipe and said, "I'd like to give this pipe to a soldadito who treated me with dignity." And at that point in time, Sergeant Terán broke into the room. "Yo quiero la pipa, mi capitán. I want the pipe." And he said, "No, I won't give it to you." So I ordered the sergeant twice to leave the room, and he did. Then I said, "Commander, will you give it to me?" He thought for a few seconds and said, "Sí, a ti sí te la doy. I will give it to you." So I put the pipe on my pocket and I said, "Is there anything you want for your family?" Then in such a sarcastic way, he said, "If you can, tell Fidel he will soon see a triumphant revolution in America." And then he changed his expression and said, "And if you can, tell my wife to remarry and try to be happy." That's all he said. I understood. He came to where I was, we shook hands, we embraced, and then he stood in attention thinking I was going to be the one to execute him. So I left the room.
In reality, Che Guevara stands for the brutality of the Cuban Revolution. He stands for his support for international terrorism. He stands for the failure of the economy in Cuba and his own failure in the actions as a guerrilla leader in El Congo and in Bolivia. So his image is different than what he was and the reality of what he did in Cuba and in other parts of the world.
Well, you have to put in that context at that point in time. It was very emotional for me. I had never had to order the execution of anybody in my life. It was a very unique situation, and this man conducted himself with dignity. So we had mutual respect for each other at that point in time.
In part, he was a misfit. In part, he was a anti-American revolutionaries like many youth in Latin America that disliked the United States and hated the United States. He was an adventurer, and he was ruthless, and he was somewhat that had a significant disdain for the Cuban people, looked down on the Cuban people, maybe like many Argentinians. He signed, as you know, Cuban bills when he was president of the National Bank as Che. He didn't put his name, he put his nickname, which was Che. So that looked like disrespectful to the Cuban people. But Che thought himself as above the Cubans, looked at the Cubans as mulattoes, black, poor Cubans, and he as an Argentinian intellectual, much more savvy than most Cubans.
Outside was Sergeant Terán with Lieutenant Perez. I told him, "Sergeant, don't shoot from here up, shoot from here down, because this man is supposed to die from combat wound. This is order from your high command." He said, see me, Capitan. And I left. I understand that he borrowed an M2 carbine from Lieutenant Perez. He went to the room and he executed Che.
Che, Fidel y Raúl Castro eran los máximos líderes o jefes de la banda, de esa banda de comunistas que querían imitar a Stalin en América. Desde el primer momento entendieron la necesidad de crear campos de trabajo forzado y campos de concentración. Primero que crearon fue en Guanacavive, Sandino y pueblos cautivos y la UMAP para albergar ahí a todas las personas que se lo opusieran al régimen comunista. Los campos de la UMAP en Cuba eran campos de concentración al estilo de los gulags soviéticos o de los campos de concentración nazis. Y fueron creados para todos los jóvenes que en el principio de la revolución no cooperaban con el sistema y no eran susceptibles a ser adoctrinados. Los campos de concentración de la UMAP, lo único que tuvieron diferente a los campos nazis fue que no habían crematorios. Había hambre, falta de atención médica, represión, golpizas, muertes por pelotones de fusilamiento. Más de 500 personas perdieron la razón, enloquecieron y casi un centenar fueron asesinados. Cuando estábamos en el campo de concentración, el día antes, por informaciones clandestinas, supimos que había muerto el Che Guevara. Todos estábamos muy contentos, pero no podíamos manifestar nuestra alegría. Al siguiente día nos reunieron en el lugar que nos llevaban a darnos la comida, y ahí unos oficiales nos informaron, mirándonos fijamente a los ojos y tratando de percibir alguna alegría para castigarnos, porque sabíamos que nosotros estábamos muy alegres porque hubieran matado a alguien que había creado estos diabólicos campos de concentración. Y fue una reunión en ese comedor que yo recuerdo, había una atmósfera de silencio total, había una represión que se respiraba de la forma de que ellos, los carceleros, nos miraban a nosotros queriendo adivinar o queriendo descubrir algún vestigio de alegría en nosotros para llevarnos a un sistema carcelario más fuerte, mandarlos a las celdas de castigo, etc. Yo vivo hace 28 años en Estados Unidos y uno de los dolores más fuertes que tengo es que nunca consideré que en la tierra de Washington, Jefferson y Lincoln pudiera yo tener que combatir con ideas y tantas mentiras del Che Guevara. El Che Guevara en Estados Unidos muchos creen que era un hombre que iba a liberar a los pobres, era como el Mesías para los pobres, para los oprimidos. Todo lo contrario, el Che Guevara era un asesino. Lo único que hizo muy grande fue asesinar cubanos. Nunca fue un combatiente real. Él nunca fue un guerrillero. Nadie asmático, crónico, puede ser un líder de una guerrilla ni vivir en la selva. Yo creo que el pueblo norteamericano está muy desinformado del verdadero Che Guevara. Yo considero que la desinformación que hay acerca de la figura de Che es primordialmente de la prensa, que no ha hecho su trabajo de información. Ha sido una propaganda sobre un héroe místico inventado por la prensa. Eso es un héroe inventado por los enemigos de la democracia.
No shame like you think you do, as he takes us for his fools. And she does not know shame, as his image dons her shirt, dons their shoes. And we don't know the one who put his finger on the trigger of the gun. And how they romanticize his motorcycle ride before her father died, then laid him in the sun. Stood along death's wall until their names were called just before their fall to doom. No cover for his eyes, he will count for them and decide his time to die. And we don't know the one who put his finger on the trigger of the gun. And then how they romanticize his motorcycle ride before her father died and laid him in the sun. Watch the boy who is just 13 standing in the yard slowly fall to eternity. See the hurt and pain for the ones they lost, burn his image in the flame. And you don't know shame. When you do, then cover up his face of shame. For them denounce the one who with his finger pulled the trigger of those guns. And how they romanticize his motorcycle ride before her father died, then laid him in the sun. You don't know shit. You don't know shit. You don't know shit like you think you do, as he takes us for his fools. And she does not know shame, as his image dons her shirt, dons their shoes. And we don't know the one who put his finger on the trigger of the gun. And how they romanticize his motorcycle ride before her father died, then laid him in the sun. once more.